Good afternoon, everyone, and happy last day of November. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving, and I'm glad that you didn't get so full of Thanksgiving that you didn't want to hear another Thanksgiving story. So this story is special to me. My sisters and my family of origin live in Mobile, Alabama, and so my sister gave me this story and a Christmas memory as an early Christmas gift one year. And I enjoyed the stories very much. And I don't know if you're familiar with this particular story. I know the other one, the Christmas memory, is much more familiar. So you may have sat across the table this Thanksgiving or some Thanksgiving from someone that wasn't quite your favorite person. There's a lot of talk about that. But this story is about a young boy who has to invite his arch enemy for Thanksgiving dinner. And this is a story of what happens with him. The Thanksgiving visitor. Talk about mean. Odd Henderson was the meanest human creature in my experience. And I'm speaking of a 12-year-old boy, not some grown-up who has had time to ripen into a naturally evil disposition. Odd was 12 in 1932 when we were both in the second grade, attending a small town school in rural Alabama. Tall for his age, a bony boy with muddy red hair and yellow eyes. He towered over all of us. For one reason, the rest of us were 7 and 8 years old. He had failed first grade twice, and this was his second term in second grade. And this sorry record wasn't due to his dumbness. Odd was intelligent, but he took after the rest of the Henderson. They were a surly bunch, every one of them, always wanting to do you a bad turn. Odd wasn't the worst of the lot, and brother, that is saying something. Many children in our school came from families poorer than the Hendersons. Odd had a pair of shoes, while some boys, and girls too, were forced to go barefoot through the bitterest weather. That's how hard the Depression hit Alabama. But nobody, I don't care, nobody looked as down and out as Odd. A skinny, freckled scarecrow in sweaty, cast-off overalls. It would have been a humiliation for a chain gang convict to wear. You might have felt pity for him if he hadn't been so hateful. All the kids feared him, not just us little ones, but even the big ones, his age and older. Nobody ever picked a fight with him except a girl named Ann Jumbo Lynchburg, who happened to be the other town bully. Well, that was something else. It took 3 teachers to pull those two apart. And Jumbo never wanted a rematch with Odd after that. I just wished that he would just leave me alone. Considering the era and the locale, I was living fairly well off. I lived in an old country house situated where the town ended and the farms and the forest began. The house belonged to distant relatives, elderly cousins, and these cousins, 3 maiden ladies and their bachelor brother, took me under their wing when my own family had a disturbance that seemed to not have a solution, which had left me stranded in this somewhat eccentric Alabama household. Not that I was unhappy here. Indeed, moments of those years turned out to be the happiest part of an otherwise difficult childhood. mainly because the youngest of the cousins, a woman in her 60s, became my first friend. As she was a child herself, many people thought her even less than that and murmured about her as though she were the twin of poor, nice Lester Tucker who roamed the streets in a sweet daze. But she understood me absolutely. Perhaps it was strange for a young boy to have as his best friend an aging spinster, but neither of us had an ordinary outlook or background, and so it was inevitable in our separate loneliness that we should become to share a friendship apart. Except for the hours I spent at school, my cousin and old Queenie, our terrier, my cousin was called Miss Sook by everyone else. She and I spent all of our time together. Much of our time was spent in the kitchen, a farmhouse kitchen, mostly beside our big black wood-burning stove. Miss Sook, sensitive as a shy lady fern, a recluse who had never traveled beyond the county boundaries, was unlike her brother and her sister, who were more worldly. But nevertheless, Miss Sook had her job, and it was to make sure that Uncle B got fed and enough. And so that was our job. And breakfast was our principal meal because the hands on the farm would come and eat before the day's work. So we would rise at 4 o'clock in the morning and heat up the stove, and we would prepare this feast. So this is wonderful. Fried pork chops, fried catfish, fried squirrel in season, fried eggs, hominy grits with black-eyed peas, collards with collard liquor, and cornbread to mush it in, biscuits, pound cake, pancakes, and molasses, honey in the comb, homemade jams and jellies, sweet milk, and coffee, chicory flavored and hot as Hades. Quite the breakfast. All the other meals were leftovers from breakfast. Nevertheless, depending on the season and the number of hands, there were sometimes as many as 15 people sitting down to breakfast at 5:30 in the morning. So my friend was very busy. She cleaned the house and did the laundry, and she chopped firewood and took care of chickens. She did all of this, so when I came home, she was ready for me. And we played cards, and we ran in the woods, and she loved to pore over my textbooks, especially geography. The atlas. Oh, Buddy, she would say. She called me Buddy, because she called me Buddy. Just think of it, a lake named Titicaca that really exists somewhere in the world. My education was her education as well. Due to a childhood illness, she had almost no schooling, but she took a bristling pride in our report cards. Gosh, Buddy, 5 A's. Even arithmetic, I didn't dare to hope we'd get an A in arithmetic. It was a mystery to her why I hated school, why I sometimes wept in the morning. Of course, it wasn't that I hated school, it was Odd Henderson. He would wait for me every morning under a tree just outside the schoolyard, and he would have a sack of cockleburrs, and he would throw me to the ground. And there was no reason for me to run because he was so fast, it was impossible. He'd throw me down, and he'd rub those into my hair, and I was miserable. And so our second grade teacher was pretty sympathetic up to a point. She suspected what was happening, but it happened that over and over again I'd be late for school. And so, exasperated by my tardiness, she raged at me in front of the whole class. "Little Mr. Big Britches, what a big head he has, waltzing in here 20 minutes after the bell." Whereupon I lost control and pointed at Odd Henderson and shouted, "Yell at him! He's the one to blame, that son of a bitch!" I knew a lot of curse words, but I myself was shocked when I heard what I said to my teacher. So she came straight toward me, "Hold out your hands, palms up." And you know what happened. My eyes blurred from the pain. It would take a page in small print to list the imaginative punishments he inflicted on me. But what I resented the most was the sense of dour expectation that I knew he was going to do something. I just didn't know what it was or when it was, but I lived with that kind of distress. And often at night, I would dream about him, and I'd cry out in my sleep, and Miss Sook would come to me, and she'd ask, should we call the doctor? But then she knew I was just remembering school and Odd Henderson. But now I had stopped talking about it. It didn't make any difference for me to tell my friend about Odd. She just said, "Oh, buddy," she'd say, "he only picks on you out of jealousy. He's not smart and pretty like you are." Well, my cousins had never married. Uncle B had almost married until his fiancée returned the ring when she saw that she'd be sharing the house with 3 spinsters, each with their own challenges and special personalities. The house, though, was the largest and the most conveniently located, and it was traditional for all the relatives to come to our house for Thanksgiving. It wasn't too much trouble because we only provided the setting and an ample number of stuffed turkeys. The guests supplied the trimmings, each of them contributing some special dish. One made a perfect ambrosia, another a dish of whipped sweet potatoes and raisins, and another an array of vegetables from the garden. But my favorite was the cold banana pudding that was brought each year by a very special cousin who took the recipe to her grave. Miss Sook, "Buddy, what? You haven't listened to one word. Sorry, I figure we'll need 5 turkeys this year. When I spoke to Uncle B about it, he said he wanted you to kill them and dress them too." "Me? Why?" "He says a boy ought to know how to do things like that." Slaughtering was Uncle B's job, and it was an ordeal for me to even watch. "Okay, buddy, you're right, but we'll just tell." Okay, just a minute. Got ahead of myself. She said, "Of course you won't. I'll get Bubber and give him a nickel and let him do it, but we'll let Uncle B think you did it. And then he won't think that what we're doing is such a bad thing." "What bad thing?" "Our always being together. He says you ought to have other friends. boys your own age. Well, he's right. I don't want another friend. Hush, buddy, now hush. You've been real good to me. I don't know what I'd do without you, but I want to see you happy. And for you to go out in the world, you've got to learn to deal with people like Odd Henderson. And so I want you to make him your friend. Well, he's the last friend in the world that I would want. Please, buddy, invite that boy here for Thanksgiving dinner. When I realized that she was serious, I was bewildered, and I knew we were headed toward a falling out. I thought you weren't my friend. I am, buddy, truly. If you were, you couldn't think of a thing like that. Odd Henderson hates me. He's my enemy. He can't hate you. He doesn't even know you. Well, I hate him. Well, that's because you don't know him. So what I want you to do is to get to know each other a little bit, and then I think this trouble will stop. You're right, buddy. Maybe you won't ever be friends, but I doubt that he'd pick on you anymore if he came for Thanksgiving dinner. You don't understand. You never hated anybody. No, I never have. We are allotted only so much time on this earth, and I wouldn't want the Lord to see me wasting mine in any such manner. I won't do it. He'd think I was crazy, and I would be. The rain had let up, leaving a silence that lengthened miserably. My friend's clear eyes contemplated me as though I were a rook card, and she was trying to figure out how to play. She maneuvered a salt and pepper lock of her hair off her forehead and sighed. Then I will. Tomorrow, I'll put on my hat and pay a call on Molly Henderson. This state meant that she was determined, for I'd never known Miss Sook to ever plan a call on anyone. She was too modest to presume a welcome. I don't think there'll be much Thanksgiving in that house, and I bet his mother will be glad for him to come here. I laughed at that, and my dear friend thought, oh, you understand now. And I said, no, my merriment had other origins. I didn't tell her. One was the picture of Uncle B carving turkey for all those cantankerous Hendersons gathered around our table. The second was that it had occurred to me that I had no cause for alarm. Miss Sook might extend the invitation, and Odd's mother might accept it on his behalf, but he would never come. He would see it as an act of charity, and those Hendersons didn't want any charity. At lunchtime, he would never take the meals that were available for families who didn't have food for their children. He'd wander off by himself and devour a pocket full of peanuts or gnaw on a large turnip. This kind of pride was characteristic of the Hendersons. I went to bed that night with a light heart, for I was certain that my Thanksgiving would not be marred by the presence of such an unsuitable visitor. And the good news was the next morning I woke up with a bad cold, and that was pleasant. It meant no school, no Odd Henderson. So I could have a fire in my room and cream of tomato soup and hours with David Copperfield. It was drizzling again, but true to her promise, my friend fetched her hat with the straw cartwheel decorated with weather-faded roses and set out for the Henderson home. "I won't be but a minute," she said. In fact, she was gone 2 hours. I couldn't imagine Miss Sook sustaining a conversation that long. Still wearing her hat and an old loose raincoat when she came back, she stuck a thermometer in my mouth, and she said, "I have always liked Molly Henderson. She does all she can." And the house was as clean as Bob Spencer's fingernails. He was the Baptist minister, known for his cleanliness. It made me feel ashamed, Buddy. It hurt me all the way down to see somebody struggling like Molly, never to see a clear day. I'm not saying people should have everything they want, though maybe that would be good too. The shame I feel is for all of us who have anything extra when other people have nothing. I mentioned to Molly how I had extra quilts, and she said, no, we are fine. All we need is for my husband to come home from prison. And Buddy, you must have been wrong about Odd Henderson. His mother says he is a great help to her with the other children, and he does all the chores she gives him. The thermometer had kept me silent, but now I demanded, "What about the invitation?" And she answered, "Why, Molly was happy to hear that you thought enough of Odd to invite him for Thanksgiving." And she continued, ignoring my groan. She said he would be tickled to come. "Your temperature is just over 100, so you'll have to stay home again tomorrow." Fine with me. As it happened, I was spending a lot of time the next few days just enjoying not being tormented. But yet Odd remained a presence, a red-headed silhouette on the threshold of my cheerfulness. Now, Miss Sook knew that my croup wasn't that bad, so she allowed me to get up and help her with the preparations for Thanksgiving. So we did everything together, which we always did, and it was so fun. Poor Queenie was relegated to the kitchen for fear she might leave a stray hair, or even worse, a flea, in the most dignified areas of the house. One of our tasks was to gather flowers from the garden to put in vases on the table. Chrysanthemums, some as big as a baby's head, are what we gathered, bundles of curled, penny-colored leaves with flickering lavender underhues. "Chrysanthemums," my friend commented as we walked through the garden, "are like kingly characters. I always expect them to spring, to turn on me with a growl and a roar." Well, it was those kind of remarks that made people wonder about my dear Miss Sook. I understand in retrospect why they were concerned. She said, "Look at Queenie. Queenie thinks that we are pretty strange characters." A lively day that Thanksgiving, lively with on and off showers and abrupt sky clearings accompanied by thrust of raw sun and sudden bandit winds snatching autumn leaves. The noises of the house were lovely too, pots and pans, and my uncle greeting our guests as they arrived. Some came by horseback or mule-drawn wagons, the majority in farm trucks, and Mr. and Mrs. Conklin and their 4 beautiful daughters came in a mint green 1932 Chevrolet. The first guests to arrive were Mary Taylor Wheelwright. Escorted by her custodians, she said to my uncle, "Now, darling Bobby, I'm really sorry we're a itty bit early, but you know me, I want to make sure I'm here. However, everybody arrived early, and the parlor got fuller and fuller. By noon, not another soul could be accommodated in the parlor. There was a hive of women with their tattle and their womanly aromas. Lilac water, and another smelled like geraniums after rain. On the porch, the smell was tobacco. That's where the men were gathered. It was the parlor I preferred, due to the presence of the Conklin sisters, who played by turn our untuned piano with a gifted, rollicking lack of airs. Annabelle played and sang. She was the oldest of the sisters and the loveliest. While I was listening to Annabelle and falling in love with her, I felt Odd Henderson. I say felt because I was aware of him before I ever saw him. The sense of peril that warns, that experts woodsmen, it tells them that to beware of a rattler. I turned, and there the fellow stood in the parlor entrance, half in, half out. To others, he might have seemed simply a grubby 12-year-old beanpole who had made some attempt to comb his hair. The comb grooves were still noticeable on his head, but to me, he was as unexpected and sinister as a genie released from a bottle. I couldn't believe that I didn't think he would come. I didn't remember all that I had learned about him. And so it was the joy of spoiling the day for me that had caused him to come. However, Odd had not seen me yet, so I slipped past and went into the kitchen where my cousin was. She had gone in there because she really didn't like to be in social settings. And so I told her, "He's here, Odd Henderson." "Then why aren't you with him?" "That's not polite, buddy. He's your particular guest. You ought to be out there." Seeing that he meets everyone and has a good time, I can't speak to him. And so she took me by the hand and she took me into the room. She didn't need to fret because he too had fallen in love with Annabelle, and he was up close to her on the piano bench. But hauling me over, my friend introduced herself to him. "Buddy, we're so happy you could come. Odd had the manners of a billy goat. He didn't stand up or offer his hand. He hardly even looked at her." Daunted but dead game, my friend said, "Maybe Odd will sing us a tune. His mother told me he could sing." So giggling, Annabelle began to play on the piano, and he began to sing, "When the red, red robin comes bob, bob, bobbing along," and the Adam's apple in his throat jumped while he sang, and all I could think about was murder. Murder was what I had in mind. I could have killed him as easily as a mosquito. Once more, unnoticed even by my friend, I slipped out, and this time I went to a place I called the Island, which was a large closet just beside our one bathroom. And in this closet, there was a stained glass window that had chips in it, and you could peek and see a little bit about who was in the bathroom. And so I sat there for a while just feeling sorry for myself. And then another person came in. And she came in, Miss Mary Taylor Wheelwright. She stopped before the mirror and she smacked her face with her powder puff and rouged her antique cheeks and looked at herself and said, "Very nice, Mary." And then she went out. And I was about to just give up and go eat dinner when I heard the dinner bell. But then I heard footsteps. And guess who it was? It was Odd Henderson. He came into the bathroom and he undid his trousers and had let go with a forceful splash as he whistled along like a jaunty jaybird. And as he was leaving, an open box on the bureau summoned his attention. Now, in this cigar box was recipes torn out of papers and other junk. And in that box was a cameo, a brooch that her father had given my dear friend a long time ago. Now, there was a lot of sentimental value there, but we imagined that that cameo could be our ticket out. If things ever got too bad, we'd sell that cameo and we'd leave and go to New Orleans. We never thought about what we'd do in New Orleans, but we would go. Well, Odd saw that cameo, and I saw his fingers reach toward it, and I watched him hold it in the palm of his hand and drop it back in the box. And then he started to leave, and he returned. And he took the brooch again, and he put it in his pocket. At first, I almost jumped out and jumped on him and challenged him. But then I had this wonderful idea of revenge. Odd had handed me an ideal instrument for revenge that would make up for all the cockleburs. So in the dining room, long tables were set up, and Uncle B was at the center of the tea, and my friend was sitting with the children. And my own mouth would have watered for all that good food had I not had my heart pounding about my revenge. Uncle B recited the grace, "Bless you, Lord, for the bounty of our table. We are thankful for this in this troubled year." And then as the chairs were adjusted and the napkins unfolded, I had the opportunity, and I stood up and I said, "Someone here is a thief. Odd Henderson is a thief. He stole Miss Sook's cameo." Napkins gleamed in their suspended, immobilized hands. Men coughed, the Conklin sisters gasped, and the children hiccuped. My friend, in a voice teetering between reproach and anguish, said, "Buddy doesn't mean that. He's only teasing." "I do mean it. If you don't believe me, go look in your box. The cameo isn't there. Odd Henderson has it in his pocket." "Buddy has had the bad croup. He doesn't know what he's saying." I said, "Go look in your box." Uncle B, staring at me with an alarming winteriness, took charge. He said, "Maybe you better go look. That should settle the matter." Now, it was not often that my friend disobeyed her brother, and she didn't that time. But she didn't want to do this. You could tell by the mortified angle of her shoulders and the distaste with which she accepted the errand. She was only gone a minute, and she came back. "Shame on you, buddy, playing that kind of a joke. My cameo was right where I left it." Uncle B said, "Buddy, I I want to hear you apologize to our guest." "No, he don't have to do that," Odd Henderson said. He was telling the truth. He dug in his pocket and he put the cameo on the table. "I wish I had some kind of excuse to give, but I ain't got none." And starting for the door, he said, "You must be some kind of lady," to my dear friend, to fib for me like that. And then, damn his soul, he just walked right out the door. And so did I, but I ran, and I ran, and I ran, and I ran to the neighboring farm, to the barn, and to the smokehouse, and I ruined my Sunday suit, and I just felt miserable. And I thought, I'm going to do something to make them sorry. And then I saw some bottles with cross bones on it, and I thought, I'll drink that, and then they'll be really sorry. But then I started thinking, I wouldn't actually be able to hear what they said if I was dead. So I decided not to do that. Uncle B must have forbidden Miss Sook to go look for me until the last guest had left the table. It was late afternoon before I heard her voice floating across the pasture. When she called my name softly, like a mourning dove, I stayed where I was and I didn't answer. It was Queenie who found me. She sniffed around the smokehouse, and when she found my scent, she came to me. "Come here, buddy." And I wanted to go to her. When she saw me, she laughed. "Goodness, boy, you look like you're dipped in tar and ready for feathering." But there were no recriminations or references to my ruined suit. Queenie trotted off to pester some cows, and we sat down on a tree stump. "I saved you a drumstick," she said, handing me a parcel wrapped in wax paper, "and your favorite piece of turkey, the pulley." The hunger, that dire sensation had numbed me until now, hit me like a belly punch. I gnawed that drumstick clean, then stripped the pulley, the sweet part of the turkey, around the wishbone. While I was eating, Miss Sook put her arm around me, and she talked to me. And she taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. She said, "There's just this thing I want to say, buddy. 2 wrongs never make a right. It was wrong of him to take the cameo, but we don't know why he took it. Maybe he never meant to keep it. Whatever his reason, it can't have been calculated. Which is why what you did was much worse. You planned to humiliate him. It was deliberate. But listen to me, buddy. There is only one unpardonable sin, and that is deliberate cruelty. All else can be forgiven. That never. Do you understand me, buddy?" I did, dimly at that time, but time has taught me that she was right. And part of what I was feeling at that moment was, how did he emerge as a better person than me? I couldn't believe it. "Buddy, do you understand?" Sort of. And then I held up the pull bone and I said, take one side. And we pulled it and I got the larger one. So I got to have a wish. And she said, "What wish do you want?" And I said, "That you're still my friend." "Dumbhead," she said, and hugged me. "Forever? I won't be here forever, buddy, nor will you." Her voice sank like the sun on the pasture's horizon. It was silent a second, and then it climbed back up with the strength of a new sun. She said, "But yes, forever. The Lord willing, you'll be here a long time after I'm gone. And as long as you remember me, we'll always be together. Afterward, Odd Henderson let me alone. I couldn't believe it. He started picking on a boy his own age, Squirrel McMillan. And the next year, his poor grades and his even worse behavior caused the principal to tell him he just couldn't come to school. So he left, and he was working on a dairy farm. And the last time I saw him was shortly before he hitchhiked to Mobile to join the Merchant Marines and disappeared. It must have been the year before I was packed off to a military academy, of all things, and 2 years prior to my friend's death. That would make it the autumn of 1934. Miss Sook had summoned me to the garden. She had transplanted a blossoming chrysanthemum bush into a tin washtub and needed help to haul it up the steps onto the porch, where it would make a fine display. It was heavier than 40 fat pirates, and while we were struggling with it ineffectively, Odd Henderson appeared walking down the road. He paused at the garden gate, and he opened it, saying, "Let me do that for you." Ma'am, life on the dairy farm had done him good. He was tanned rather than the way he had been before, and he had thickened. His arms were sinewy, and he just looked a lot better. My friend said, all right, so he lifted the big tub and placed it on the porch. My friend said, "I'm obliged to you, sir. That was neighborly." "Nothing," he said, still ignoring me. Miss Sook snapped the stems of her showiest blossoms. "Take these to your mother," she said, "and give her my love." "Thank you, ma'am, I will." And Odd, she called, but he was already on the road. "Be careful. Those chrysanthemums are lions, you know." But he was already out of hearing. We watched until he turned the bend at the corner, innocent of the menace that he carried, the chrysanthemums that burned, that growled, that roared against a greenly lowering dusk. The end.